Your introduction is, yes, okay.
Okay. I'm not going to spoil Diane's presentation because that's why you're here. But as you can see, Diane has a long history of, I don't hope you don't mind me saying that you probably are a Civil War geek like all of us. And you saw some of the book titles that she has written. So one of them, Command Conflicts, there it is in Grant's Overland Campaign, Chamberlain at Petersburg, etc. And tonight she is going to share an intriguing story about the gentleman who eventually designed the Brooklyn Bridge. And I had no idea that he had a Civil War background. So Diane, if you're ready.
Yes, we are.
Maybe.
Okay. And can people hear, I hope, through my hokey? And you can talk loud. I mean, I don't know if that makes a difference. We've got a funny speaker set up here, so.
Talk loudly.
Very good. Hello, Ann Arbor. Greetings from the wilds of Maine. I thank you for the opportunity of sharing Washington Roebling Civil War with you. I'm Diane Monroe Smith, and this is my husband, Ned. Do you want to lean in and say hello?
Hello.
He's my IT guy, but he's also a Civil War author who has done a number of unit histories on Maine regiments. So we're very happy to be here, and we'll get started. The first slide that we're showing you gives you kind of the pathway to the Roebling book. Back in the 1990s, I was doing research on Joshua Chamberlain, and his service was with the 5th Corps. So that was the beginning of the path of looking at the Army of the Potomac from the aspect of 5th Corps. The second book was Chamberlain at Petersburg, a previously unpublished account of him and his brigade at Petersburg during the Overland Campaign. And then because there were, to me, a lot of odd discrepancies between the service of the 5th Corps and the way it's come down to us in history, I wrote Command Conflicts to share with you some of those oddities that I tripped upon. You can't spend very much time with the 5th Corps, Army of the Potomac, without running into Washington Roebling, and that's been my latest book. So let's move on to the next slide. Most people know Roebling as the chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge, and rightly so. Great American icon. The Roebling family became very powerful and very rich, especially after the Civil War, because of their invention of what at the time was called wire rope. Today we would call it cable. Let's move on. The founder of the industry was Washington's father, John Roebling, who was a German immigrant. He was a brilliant man, a brilliant engineer, but he was an absolutely appalling husband and father. He was violently abusive, embraced all kinds of strange health regimens and hydrotherapies, and his family had a very difficult life with him.
Oops.
Washington's first service took place with the 6th Independent Battery of New York. And it was a good fit for him. He was a recent graduate of Rensselaer Polytech, which at the time was the premier engineering school in America. And he was right at home with the mathematics and the science of artillery.
And it's also the school where our older son graduated.
Yeah.
Can you folks still hear us okay?
I hope so.
I hope so too.
Yeah. The unit was actually stationed at Harper's Ferry. They missed first Bull Run. The first action that they saw, unfortunately, was at Ball's Bluff. No opportunity to fire back. They were next stationed below DC on the Potomac, dueling artillery with their rebel counterparts across the river. Next slide, please. But in the spring of 62, they were summoned to join McClellan's Peninsula campaign. Their battery was sent down the river on a barge. It was dropped off in the roads, waiting to be taken ashore, when out came the CSS Virginia. And the 6th New York Battery found themselves right in the middle of a duel between the Virginia and Federal gunships. They actually loaded one of their cannons, but decided against using it. So Washington Roebling was happy with the 6th New York, but unbeknownst to him, his father, John Roebling, had other plans for him. John had some strong connections with the government in Washington. His cables were being used to lift the stones to the top of the unfinished Capitol dome. He had a meeting, you can change the slide, with General Meigs, and convinced Meigs that what the Army really needed was military suspension bridges. And before Roebling knew it, he was pulled away from his battery and brought to Washington. He was ordered to write a book on military suspension bridges by General Meigs. And there's still copies of it. It exists. There's one of the drawings here. Interestingly enough, when it actually got published, Roebling's name was nowhere to be seen. Only General Meigs' name was on the book. You can go ahead, hon. I don't think that's the next slide.
Sorry, is this the one?
There we go.
Sorry, my fault.
It's his fault. So Roebling was then assigned to act as an aide and a scout for General McDowell, who was then serving with General Pope. It was the beginning of Roebling's solo scouting and taking many chances in scouting for the enemy, finding roads, finding their installations. You can go on. While most of the time he acted by himself, and he did worry sometimes whether his uniform would protect him from being tried as a spy if he was caught. But in one particular situation, he went out, he was assigned to go out with a large reconnaissance of Federal cavalry that was actually commanded by Thornton Broadhead of the 1st Michigan. It was
Sorry.
it was an amazing adventure in this way. The Federal cavalry entered enemy territory at a place called Raccoon Ford. The Longfellow, General Longstreet had assigned someone to guard that ford, that crossing, and but they were half miffed because Longstreet had moved some of his troops without his permission. And so he just walked away. So Bradhead and near 1,000 federal troopers crossed at Raccoon Ford. No problem, nobody there. They rode through enemy territory that was actually just teeming with Confederate troops, but somehow managed to avoid them until they came across
Yes.
yes, okay, until they came across a dispatch rider. They were able to capture some of Lee's orders, but when they ran into trouble, was,
Keep it down,
yeah,
physically down.
yes.
Yeah.
They eventually ran into trouble with rebel cavalry and barely made it back to federal lines. Roebling managed to get back to federal lines, although by the time he got there, his horse was completely disabled. He ended up walking with and carrying his saddle, and it took him days to get back to McDowell's headquarters, which was ever shifting at that point. Could we have the next slide, please? It would end up after that campaign that Roebling had really very little respect for McDowell for this reason. That in the investigation after what happened at Second Bull Run, Roebling was called to testify, and McDowell not only told Roebling what all the questions were going to be, which she knew ahead of time, but also instructed him on how he should answer. You can go on. With McClellan being reinstated, Roebling was assigned to serve under General Hooker and with General Meade in the First Corps, Army of the Potomac. You can have the next slide, please. This is a map of Antietam that was made by Washington Roebling. You can get the next slide, please. Roebling had respect for Hooker as a Corps commander. When Hooker became the commander of the Army of the Potomac, not so much. You can go on, huh? Roebling said years after the war that he believed that Butterfield was the real brains behind the plan for Chancellorsville, and that Hooker's greatest mistake was not keeping Butterfield by his side during that campaign.
Butterfield?
Yes.
Oh,
Okay, I think you skipped a slide again.
no. No.
Maybe no. Okay. So Roebling actually accompanied the Sixth Corps to their position at Chancellorsville. And when he returned to Hooker's headquarters on May 1st, he was surprised to find absolutely nothing going on. And what he was told by fellow aides is that Hooker had been so pleased at how well the campaign was going that he had celebrated the night before and he was still asleep. This was about 9 o'clock in the morning. So there wasn't really any orders that went out, any movement until 11 o'clock in the morning. General Slocum, who we have pictured here, was leading some 13,000 men and was moving against Lee's lines. When Hooker told Roebling that he had changed his mind, that he wanted the movement to stop, and for Slocum to reverse his march and return to Chancellorsville. Slocum was outraged. Roebling was the unfortunate who was sent to tell him, to give him these orders. And what Slocum said to Roebling that day was, Roebling, you're a damn liar. Nobody but a crazy man would give such an order when we have a victory in sight. I shall go to Hooker myself, and if I find that you've spoken falsely, you'll be shot when I return. Well, Slocum found out that that's exactly what Hooker's orders were. The other event that Roebling experienced with Hooker happened at that chancellor's house. I don't know if you can actually see on the slide the porch with the pillars on the front of the house. It happened that Roebling was leaning on one side of the pillar while Hooker was leaning on the other. When Roebling saw an artillery shell, an enemy artillery shell, headed right for him, and he yelled out, "Get back, General," to Hooker. It undoubtedly saved his life, but it knocked him silly. A matter of fact, his staff thought he was dead. He was so unconscious. Roebling would later, in later years, express some regret that he had warned Hooker. It's kind of a shocking admission, but I guess you could say it's one of the what ifs that we all engage in as far as the war is concerned. What if, instead of withdrawing, instead of Chancellorsville being a Union defeat, what if it had been a Union victory? Would there have been a Gettysburg? Would there have been an overland campaign? There's, could we go back to the other slide, please? There's, I considered Sears' book with a great deal of good research, but we draw some very different conclusions. He seemed to have taken an intense dislike to Roebling, discounting his testimony. Matter of fact, he described Roebling as being twisted and self-important, and that's not the Roebling I encountered. How many topographical engineers would admit, for instance, as Roebling did, that he got royally lost during the withdrawal from Chancellorsville? I also disagree with Sears' accounts that the Union Army wasn't demoralized after Chancellorsville. I think there's a lot of people, including Roebling, who would disagree. Next slide, please. Roebling finally found a home with General Warren. And that included being one of the Union Army's aeronauts. It always amazes me that in those balloon baskets only came about up to their knees. But anyway, Roebling would make the ascents, draw maps, look upon the enemy, It's said that he was one of the first people that saw the Army of Northern Virginia's withdrawing and a preliminary to Gettysburg. At the time, General Warren was going to become Meade's chief engineer. You could go on, please. We all know that Meade was given command of the Army of the Potomac just before Gettysburg. Roebling actually missed the first day of Gettysburg because Warren sent him to Philadelphia to get maps of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Yes. But on the second day of Gettysburg, when General Sickles disobeyed orders and left Little Round Top uncovered, Meade sent General Warren and Roebling with him to see what was going on over there.
Can we just do one more quick check that you folks are getting the sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Just wanted to make sure.
Thank you, folks.
We went to visit Sickles' leg, by the way. It's in a military museum just north of Washington, D.C.
There's many versions told of what happened on Little Round Top that day. I'll leave you to whichever one you ascribe to, but there's no debating, you can go on to the next slide, that the Fifth Corps in particular paid a very heavy price that day. The loss of artillery commanders and Colonel Vincent. And it included a good many of the Michigan regiments, including the 16th Michigan, the smallest regiment in Vincent's brigade, only 263 men. And they bore repeated attacks from the 4th and 5th Texas. As a matter of fact, Vincent was with them when he received his mortal wound. That day, Michigan lost 60 of its 263 combatants. You can go on.
I wish I'd stopped doing that.
Me too.
There.
The next day, Roebling was at Meade's headquarters. He was sitting at a desk looking at maps when the Confederate bombardment preliminary to Pickett's charge began. A shell took off the leg of the table that Roebling was sitting at, and it was so intense that those in the headquarters really didn't dare to leave, although Roebling finally did in an attempt to save his horse's life. We'll have the next slide, hon. You might want to consider the losses at Gettysburg. And you might also say that one of the casualties was General Meade's reputation. For there was much criticism after the fact in his failing to prevent the Army of Northern Virginia from escaping. Warren and Roebling were both with the Sixth Corps in their pursuit of Lee's army. Their opinion, as well as a number of the Corps commanders of the Army of the Potomac, is that all that would have been accomplished in attacking Lee at Williamsport would have been a bloody repulse. It's of interest to me that Meade, who had such a reputation for being impatient and hard to get along with, it's interesting to me that Roebling had nothing but respect for Meade, even though sometimes he made Roebling's life very uncomfortable. But it's also interesting to me that the respect was apparently mutual, because in the upcoming campaign, the Overland campaign, Meade would frequently ask Warren to send Roebling out to scout.
Okay.
Mine Run, know that Warren was given command of the Second Corps when Hancock was wounded at Gettysburg. And he actually gave Meade a small victory at Bristow Station, but Mine Run was a different story. To describe it briefly, Warren recommended an attack at Mine Run, which Meade approved. Warren and Roebling, on the night before that attack, literally crawled on their bellies out to the Confederate lines and realized that they had managed to throw up formidable earthworks. Warren made the decision on his own to call off the attack. And Roebling was again the unfortunate who was sent to inform Meade at what Warren had done. Ultimately, Meade was not happy about it, but ultimately he agreed that Warren had made the right decision. But it strained their relationship from then on, that Warren had taken that upon himself without first getting Meade's position on. There's an interesting description of Roebling. Theodore Lyman, who was Meade's aide, described him this way. Roebling is a character. He is a light-haired, blue-eyed man with a countenance as if all the world were an empty show. He stoops a good deal. When riding, has the stirrups so long that the tips of his toes can just touch them. And as he wears no boots, the bottoms of his pantaloons are always torn and ragged. He goes poking in the most dangerous places, looking for the position of the enemy, and always with an air of entire indifference. His conversation is curt and not garnished with polite turnings. Lyman also called him the laconic one.
Should you mention that that's one of Roebling's drawings?
He, I think, probably adopted that strange way of writing because he was frequently making notes and drawing maps on the front of his saddle, and also trying to keep a low profile, of course. So I mentioned previously that I wrote Command Conflicts after spending a lot of time with the Fifth Corps, particularly during the Overland Campaign. I found so many discrepancies between what the Fifth Corps did and what ultimately has come down to us in history that I wanted to share that, and I did in Command Conflicts. You could say that what likely happened was that, those who came to rule the country politically and militarily, and I'm talking about Grant and Sheridan, were the ones who got to describe in their own words what they believe or wanted to have come down to us as far as the history of that campaign.
Mm-hmm.
You could go on. Thank you. One of the things that happened in the Overland Campaign, when Grant came east as lieutenant general, and decided to accompany the Army of the Potomac. The unfortunate thing that happened was he replaced experienced cavalry commanders in the Army of the Potomac with Sheridan and James Wilson. I'm put a copy here of Edward Steer's Wilderness Campaign because, in my opinion, he did such a masterful job of looking at the cavalry in the Overland Campaign, or well, in the Wilderness Battle at least, and giving us eye-opening account of what happened. Roebling, to some extent, was already familiar.
Can I interject?
If you must.
Diane was giving a talk down in Chancellorsville for the National Park Service a couple, 3 or 4 weeks ago?
Mhm.
And we went to the wilderness and it still looks just like that.
Some of it, at least.
Well, some of it, yeah.
Yeah.
There was a housing development in part of it.
I found this image of the undergrowth in the wilderness shocking. Matter of fact, I was going to use this photograph, and when I scrolled down, I didn't even realize the human remains here at the bottom. Somebody just recently has written a book, inexplicably, saying that, you know, historians have made much too big a deal about the conditions in the wilderness, and that it really didn't affect. I'll leave it up to you to decide what you think about that. But I wanted you to know that Roebling was already somewhat familiar with the area of the wilderness from the reconnaissance that he did in and around the Battle of Chancellorsville. We can go on to the next slide. The Fifth Corps, after Hancock returned to the Second Corps, Meade still had enough confidence in General Warren to give him command of the Fifth Corps. And as a matter of fact, the Fifth Corps was chosen to be the first to cross at Germanaplank in the start of what became known as the Overland Campaign. At the same time that Warren crossed, Wilson was accompanying the Fifth Corps, was supposed to go out the two major roads in the wilderness that allowed passage through the wilderness, the Orange Turnpike and the Orange Plank Road. And the Fifth Corps was ordered to stop in the wilderness. It's hard to understand why. Was it because the whole army was dragging a very large supply train? They were unaware that there was a threat. They believed that Lee wouldn't or couldn't approach them. What happened in the night that the Fifth Corps spent in the wilderness was Wilson failed to go out both of the roads. And the one road he did stay on, he didn't go out very far. In fact, a rebel officer reported that he heard a federal cavalryman yelling to turn back, to stay closer to the infantry for protection.
John Hammond.
The next morning, the Fifth Corps had orders to start to out on the Orange Plank Road. Grant had divided his army, while Warren and the Fifth Corps and the Sixth Corps and eventually Burnside all were supposed to cross at Germanna Ford. Hancock's Second Corps was 6 miles away, crossing at Ely's Ford. So his army was divided. It was something that Lee had quite a few successes with, not so much for Grant this day. Believing that Wilson was still out on the Orange Turnpike and the Orange Plank Road, protecting the army, screening the army, ready to warn the army. This was all a falsehood, because Warren rode off that morning without telling anyone.
Warren?
I'm sorry, Wilson rode off without warning Warren or anyone in the Army of the Potomac that he was no longer guarding those roads. Warren's Fifth Corps started their march. Matter of fact, Roebling was leading them. They got as far as the tuning farm, a high ground, the only high ground in what would become the Wilderness Battlefield. And at that point, General Griffin's First Division, which had remained behind, they were going to be the last division to leave the Wilderness, was attacked. When Warren reported this enemy incursion to Meade, he was told to attack immediately without taking time for reconnaissance or any deployment. Orders went to Roebling that he was to stop and to reverse his march. At the time, Roebling begged for permission to remain at the tuning farm. He was convinced it was the key to the battlefield, but that request was denied. Roebling also was alarmed because he heard firing from nearby Parker's store. When he went to investigate, he found this man, Colonel John Hammond of the 5th New York Cavalry. It was the only unit that Wilson had left behind, and Colonel Hammond was being confronted by an entire rebel corps coming down the Orange Turnpike.
Yeah.
You can move to the next slide. Griffin was exceedingly reluctant to attack without having any opportunity to find out who he was confronting. And protested, particularly to Warren. Roebling has said, and Warren agreed with Griffin's reluctance to make that assault. And Roebling has said after the fact that Warren was told by Grant that if he didn't attack immediately, he'd be removed from command of the 5th Corps. Now, this was just the first, or you could say the second day of the Overland campaign, and a very startling example of Grant's command style. I mentioned that Steer's Wilderness book spent a great deal of time looking at the cavalry, both Federal and Confederate. When the Wilderness became essentially a draw, a stalemate, and Grant decided to move on. On the night of May 7th and 8th, again, the Fifth Corps was called upon to lead the Army of the Potomac away from the wilderness. I'll just give you a minute to look at a comparison of the Federal Cavalry, Sheridan's cavalry on the left, how they responded that night, and Stuart's Confederate cavalry, what they accomplished on that night. While it could be said that, the cavalry had already failed Warren and the Fifth Corps and the Army of the Potomac that first stay in the wilderness, they failed them again this night of May 7th and 8th. Meade, when he reached the point where the cavalry was doing nothing to make the passage of the Fifth Corps into Spotsylvania possible, he ordered them to clear the way. They failed. Sheridan was furious that Meade gave orders to his cavalry corps and was very insubordinate. Meade complained to Grant. The result was no repercussions for Sheridan, except Grant gave him independent command, at which point Sheridan rode off with the entire cavalry corps of the Army of the Potomac. It would mean that the army was then moving through enemy territory blind. And it would also mean that men like Roebling would have to take many chances to find roads and to find where the enemy was. Okay. When the Fifth Corps finally managed to fight their way onto what became the battlefield at Spotsylvania, it's a strange thing in that if you ask people what they know about Spotsylvania, they'll tell you that it was a Second Corps and a Sixth Corps fight, that they were unaware that the Fifth Corps was even in it. But I'll show you the losses at Spotsylvania for that reason. The Fifth Corps took heavy losses there. And there's another aspect to it that we'll never know the real numbers that were lost in these battles, because they were so high that the Corps commanders were ordered to underreport them. Could you go back, please? So we'll never really know what the losses were at Spotsylvania.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah, the next major battle, there were other actions, but we'll move on to Cold Harbor. As with Spotsylvania, if you ask people who fought what corps had the major fighting at Cold Harbor, they'll tell you it was the Second Corps and the Sixth Corps and the 18th Corps. What did the Fifth Corps do? As it turned out, a great deal. The Fifth Corps was on the far right of the Army of the Potomac. And the day that most people remember, June 3rd, the one that Grant said he regretted ordering the frontal attacks that he did. The Fifth Corps was on the far right. They were responsible for guarding 4 miles of the Fifth Corps' right line. And they were facing Jubal Early's Corps and another division. And yet, when June 3rd occurred, Warren was commanded to have his men attack all along that line. Again, there was a failure as far as the cavalry was concerned. The night before the attack, the night of June 2nd and 3rd, Roebling had discovered that Jubal Early's left flank was essentially hanging in the air. Warren tried to get Wilson, who was supposed to be guarding the Fifth Corps' flank, to attack. He wasn't. Warren was so frustrated, he sent Roebling to Meade's headquarters to tell him there was a real opportunity. And Meade said, no, you know, that the plans were already laid for an attack at Cold Harbor the next morning, and sent Roebling away. To add insult to injury, Roebling's horse was stolen while he was at Meade's headquarters, and he had to borrow one to get back to the Fifth Corps. The next day, when the 2nd, 6th, and 18th Corps were attacking, Warren attempted to make his attack. Jubal Early realized the vulnerability of the Fifth Corps and counterattacked. Many of the Fifth Corps were killed, wounded, or captured. Warren complained to headquarters that Wilson had failed to protect his flank. Wilson said, you know, that he was there, but it was difficult because the night was so dark, which makes no sense because Jubal Early attacked in the middle of the day. The complaint went farther along to Sheridan, and Sheridan said, you know, that Wilson had been where he was supposed to be, and that infantry commanders were ultimately stupid. Okay.
Mhm.
There were no repercussions, by the way. Okay. There were, I don't mean to lay blame on all of the Army of the Potomac cavalry. There were men like Gregg and Merritt and Davies who did their jobs, but were in many cases under the command of those who didn't. We can move on. Grant's move from Cold Harbor to Petersburg was masterful. Would that it had had the result that it should have had with the capture of Petersburg and ultimately Richmond. I want to give credit to the Fifth Corps in their role in making it possible for the Army of the Potomac to leave Cold Harbor without Lee being aware that they had gone. The Fifth Corps was the only corps that was left behind to confront Lee. They also left Wilson and his cavalry along with the Fifth Corps, which inspired no confidence, understandably. I think we can move on. By the time the overland campaign is over, we're looking at the casualties, we're looking at the Confederate estimated casualties. This is a map that was made by Warren. Remember, he too was an engineer.
Yeah.
After what's known as the Overland Campaign is what we have become known as siege of Petersburg. It's going to last roughly 9 months, with the Army of the Potomac holding Lee's army for the most part in that area, while Grant's favorites, Sherman in the South and Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley, are supposedly winning the war. Roebling had continued to risk his life with reconnaissance. And by the end of 1864, he came to feel that if he continued to do what he had been doing, he'd never make it home to marry Emily Warren, who happened to be General Warren's sister. So in December of 1864, Roebling resigned and married Emily in January. They went to Europe for their honeymoon, an unusual honeymoon I mentioned here, because part of the time Washington spent studying the science with European engineers of caissons, working underwater, something that was going to be necessary for the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. You can go on, Tom. This is a shocking picture, but it's something that happened in the Roebling's life when John Roebling had his foot crushed at the bridge work site. He refused any medical care except for what he believed would be a water cure. He died of tetanus. Washington Roebling spent John's last days with him. It was a horrible death. One of the things I became convinced about as far as Washington Roebling was concerned, when he was an Army Scout, I believed that he would never want any soldier to go where he didn't dare to go himself. And I believe he carried that ethic with him when he became the director of the building of the bridge, because Roebling insisted on going down into the caissons where his workers were going to be laboring, to the point where he contracted caisson disease, the bends, and was literally paralyzed for a decade of his life because of it. He continued, however, to direct the building of the bridge. His wife, Emily, who was an intelligent and well-educated woman, acquired enough of the engineering jargon and knowledge to carry his instructions back and forth between Washington and those who were actually building. After Roebling left the Fifth Corps, in the continuation of the war, and it's odd because Roebling really believed that the war would last much longer than it did. Just within 3 or 4 months, the capitulation of the Army of Northern Virginia occurred. I give you this recommendation as far as reading Passing of the Armies by Joshua Chamberlain, because he was such a good witness to those last days, what actually happened. According to what Chamberlain and others saw, in those last days, the Fifth Corps had reason, had the need, had the orders to go and rescue Sheridan's cavalry, which had become mired down at Dinwiddie Courthouse. The Fifth Corps joined Sheridan's cavalry at the Battle of Five Forks. After the battle, Sheridan accused Warren of dereliction, of being too slow, and removed him of command of the Fifth Corps. And again, I recommend Chamberlain's account of what happened there. Know that Warren sought to have a court of inquiry declare his name. It never happened until after Grant's presidency. Sheridan, appointed by Grant as a lieutenant general, both of them blocked any possibility of Warren having a day in court. Roebling never really got over what happened to Warren. We have here the Warren statue at Gettysburg, Roebling sitting at his feet.
Who's the cute chickie?
I don't know. She looks familiar.
Yeah.
But anyway, Roebling had the feeling that somehow if he had stayed, if he had been there at Five Forks, somehow he could have prevented what happened to Warren, but it seems unlikely. I mentioned previously that the Roebling family became very wealthy. Matter of fact, this is the company town that developed around Roebling's mills. They happened to be in the right place at the right time. Wire rope, as it was called at that time, was needed for things like elevators, for the skyscrapers that were popping up all over the country, underwater communication cables, and even the fine wire was being used in women's corsets instead of whalebones. You have the Roebling mansion here, and also Emily Roebling in court dress in Europe high society. One of the outcomes of Roebling's wealth and power was that he really didn't have to worry, like so many others did, about telling what he knew, what he witnessed, without any worry of being beholden to men like Grant and Sheridan. He kept up a wide correspondence with other veterans, and he was often sought out because he had witnessed so much during critical events during the war. Despite all the risks he took in his life, all that had happened to him, Roebling lived to the ripe old age of 89. He wrote a memoir of his war experiences and had hoped that his son would have it published after his death, but it never did happen. It has disappeared. I still hope that someday it'll be found because I'd love to read it. So for many, this is Washington Roebling's legacy. But I'd like to think that my book, Washington Roebling Civil War, will also allow his Civil War service to be another legacy for his name. And thank you very much for joining me.